In a little over 1 hour's time, Australia's quarterly inflation rate data will be released. And if you're hanging out for an interest rate cut, you'll be hanging out for these numbers to be lower than the forecast. Our business editor, Ross Greenwood, joins me here at the desk. The markets say the RBA is more likely to cut in 3 weeks' time.
That's what the markets say, but that depends on this number. If this number comes in higher than expected, then you can almost cancel that out. The Reserve Bank will not cut rates. But if, as many expected, comes in on the lower side, back towards the twos for the underlying rate, then you could well find that there is actually an interest rate cut when the Reserve Bank meets for the first time this year in February. If we have a look at the forecast, what you can see is going back at the headline rate, which have been artificially brought down by those energy subsidies from the government. In the September quarter, 2.8%. The December quarter is forecast to be 2.5%. The question is whether that's enough, because it's right in the middle of the band between 2 and 3% that the Reserve Bank prefers. And that's what the government will even argue itself. However, that is a one-off because it's not guaranteed to be ongoing. And so what the Reserve Bank looks for is underlying inflation, taking out those one-off things such as rises in fruit and vegetable prices, spikes in petrol prices, whatever it might be. That's the trim mean. And so that, when in September was 3.5%, is forecast to go to 3.3%. And the question you now must ask is whether that is enough. If that trend mean comes in close to 3.1%, you can almost guarantee that you will get a rate cut in February. This is what the money markets say now. They say there's almost a 2/3% or 2/3 chance that rates will be cut in February, compared with a 1/3 chance that they'll be on hold. But many economists are there, not quite so optimistic as that there will be a rate cut. They're just waiting out and hanging out for this number, which will be 11:30 Eastern time today.
OK, Katie Gallagher is saying the government might bring in more inflation-fighting measures. Do these things like energy rebates really work? Because it's just doing it artificially, isn't it?
Well, that's true. Now, what the government would say is that they're taking pressure off families. And really, that is a part of their election pitch more than anything else. It costs money every time you do that. And the question is whether people actually believe it when the government says, we're here to fix your problems. So the reality is right now that if you bring down inflation by any means whatsoever, so long as it's seen to be permanent and not just fleeting, then that will play out into that underlying rate of inflation. And longer term, inflation will fall and moderate. And you can see it's happening here anyway. This is the headline rate of inflation. You can see the trend, it's down. And the reason for that is, even though you might be still having cost of living pressures because prices are not falling, it just means they're rising less quickly. The fact of the matter is that you basically need a period of time when prices are very stable to be able to give the Reserve Bank the confidence to be able to cut interest rates, because what they don't want to do is to cut interest rates, fuel spending, fuel inflation, fuel wages claims, and then suddenly have to raise interest rates again, which would hurt our economy.
Yeah, interesting. When Anthony Albanese was talking to Andrew Clennell at the weekend, he was still pointing to overseas factors. Yeah. I mean, Australians aren't blaming him for things like the war in Ukraine. There's other overseas factors like Trump 2.0.
Oh, come on, Trump's been there in power for 1 week, for goodness sakes.
No, sure.
Seriously.
But is there any...
It's time the government actually took responsibility for the cost of living crisis, which it really named. It really has to call it out for itself. It is a part of the problem. You can't deny that it's not just the supermarket's fault.
And Trump's not a surprise either.
Trump's not a surprise. Trump's done nothing yet that affects inflation here in Australia. Yeah. He may in the future, but not now. And so the fact of the matter is, you can't be going to the election saying overseas factors, overseas factors. They're in the distance. They're in the past. What's happening right now is partly as a result of the government. It's partly because you have got costs and government spending that has risen much more quickly than what you've had basically, sort of, if you like, work here in Australia. So this is, say, for example, looking at Australia versus the rest of the world, and you look at where the cash rates are versus where the inflation rates are. And you see really here in Australia that artificial inflation rate here, 2.8%, now 3.5%, but could be 3.3%, is higher than the rest of the world. Other parts of the world have brought down inflation, partly because they pushed interest rates up higher than what we had here in Australia. hurt their economies more. We have opted to try and keep people in jobs. If there's a job that Anthony Albanese should be talking about, it's about the good news factor in Australia, that people have jobs. Because if people didn't have jobs, the crisis in the cost of living would be absolutely appalling in this country.
What's going on underneath those figures, though? Because people are hurting, but most people have still kept their job.
Yes.
The employment
Which
rate.
is the only reason why Australia is not in a massive recession.
So they're having to work 2 and 3 jobs?
Yep, they are.
Is that what this data is all
right.
about? And is that why the employment rate
And that's the reason why there's stress in families, because people, as much as feeling the cost of living pressures, are feeling the pressure of having to work harder to basically make ends meet. Now, the fact is, if they didn't have a job, however, if they didn't have a job, they would not survive. They would go broke. House prices would fall. So really, in many ways, I think the government argues the wrong argument here. I think they're saying, we're here to take the cost of living pressure off you. They should be arguing, we're here to make certain you keep your job. And the fact is, we want you to keep your job.
Too.
Well, that's right, because you can't necessarily keep that promise, but you can't necessarily control prices either if you're the government. So I just find that the government, to me, argues the wrong thing here.
Okay, let's quickly talk about DeepSeek,
yes.
because it wiped $1 trillion off one of the world's biggest companies
1
yesterday.
trillion. Yeah, we're not
How
a
many
billion.
zeros is that?
Oh, is it 12?
I think
reckon
so.
it might be.
Know.
Anyway.
It doesn't matter. It's all beyond
a
me
lot.
anyway. It's a lot of money. It's a couple of BHPs there. It's come back a little bit.
Yeah.
But where's this all at now?
Well, the fact of the matter is, it's one day and it's come back. And the reality is that DeepSeek, in many ways, what it's done is it's changed the dynamics about what it costs to roll out artificial intelligence or generative artificial intelligence, where it starts to learn. And really, in this way, many people thought that NVIDIA, which makes the key GRU chips, and it dominates those around the world, well, if you need fewer of those chips to get the same results, which is what DeepSeek seems to have proven, then quite clearly you don't need as much, you're not as reliant on NVIDIA chips. Here's what it did overnight, up by 8.8%. It was strong, and the overall market in the United States, particularly for tech shares, was stronger. The so-called Big Seven, which includes the Google owner, Alphabet, and a range of others, Meta, were all up last night, Tesla as well. The Dow Jones was up a little bit. It didn't fall as much the previous night, and so that is the key. We can show you also, I think, the opening of the ASX here, and if you have a look at that, what you can see is our market will be at the opening a little stronger. So it didn't get hit too badly. This is the live price today, up by around 10 points on the opening.